Hi everyone, welcome to Andy on Crime. In today's video, I'm going to talk about 5 things that you may not know about criminal sentencing in England and Wales. Check it out. So the first thing is that criminal sentencing is not all about punishment. Now, a lot of people think that if someone is convicted of a criminal offence, the purpose of sentencing is purely to punish the offender for their actions. But that's one of 5 principles of sentencing of adult offenders in England and Wales. The other 4 are making of reparations, reform and rehabilitation, protection of the public, and the reduction in crime, including through deterrence. And when it comes to juvenile offenders, the principles are very much on their welfare and the public interest in not turning these juvenile offenders into adult offenders. Now, clearly, depending on the nature of the offence being sentenced for, this will impact on which of the 5 principles that I've outlined will be most prevalent. So if you have a very serious offence where the individual is going to spend several years in prison, then clearly punishment and protection of the public will be 2 of the foremost principles when the judge is considering sentencing. But if you have lower level offending, for example, criminal damage against a school, then the individual may be sentenced to community service for that, where you've got an element of punishment in the unpaid work aspect of that, but you also have something called rehabilitation activity, which is sessions that the individual needs to attend, which will hopefully rehabilitate them from committing those offences. So depending on the nature of the offence, depends on which of these principles is most prevalent. The second thing that you might not know about criminal sentencing is that when a judge or a magistrate is looking to sentence someone for a criminal offence, they're looking to place it in a category based on the facts of the case and the severity of the offence. And they do this by looking at 2 things. Firstly, they look at how culpable an individual is for their actions, and then they will go on to look at the harm that has been caused as a result of their actions. So what will happen is the sentencing guidelines will specify what will push something into a higher level of culpability and a higher level of harm, or a lower level of culpability and a lower level of harm. And that produces categories, generally from 1 to 3, and then harm from A to C. And then what the judge is doing is listening to the case being put forward by the prosecution and then the mitigation put forward by the defence counsel. The judge will then place this into a category based upon those factors. And then within those categories, it will set out a starting point for the offence, i.e. discounting everything else. The starting point for an average offence is this many years in prison or this level of fine. And then that will also be set out within the category as to the range of the offence. So the lower end of the offence for that category can be a fine, for example, and then the upper end could be 6 weeks in custody. So when a judge is sentencing, they're looking to place things into a category based on culpability and harm. The third thing, and this is something I see quite a lot, is that life sentences do not automatically mean that an individual will spend life in prison. How life sentences work is basically split into 2 parts. An individual will be given a life sentence, and then accompanying that life sentence, they will be given a minimum term that they will spend in prison, known as a tariff. So if we take the case of Thomas Cashman, who murdered Olivia Pratt-Korbel, as an example, he was given a life sentence with a tariff of 42 years. What that means is that he will spend a minimum of 42 years in prison before he is eligible to be considered for parole by the parole board. If the parole board sits and deems that he is safe to be released at the 42-year point, then he'll be released from prison on what's called licence for the rest of his life. And what that means is that he will be subject to a number of conditions, and this can be things like not visiting certain areas, having to abide by a curfew, and having to report to a probation officer on a regular basis. And he'll be subjected to these conditions for the remainder of his life. He'll also be considered eligible to be recalled if he commits another criminal offence, regardless of the nature of that offence, whilst he is on licence. If he is subsequently recalled and then released at a further date, he will still be subjected to those conditions. So what the life sentence part means is that having served the minimum term and satisfied the parole board that you're safe to be released, the life sentence part relates to the conditions that you will be under and liable to recall to prison for the rest of your life. Now, there are certain sentences called whole life orders, which mean that an individual will never be released from prison and never be eligible for parole. But in the main, life sentences do not automatically mean the individual spends life in prison. The fourth thing you might not know is that sentences can either be concurrent or consecutive. What that means is that where an offender is being sentenced for multiple offences, the judge will generally give a sentence for each of the individual offences, and they will then determine whether or not the sentences are to run consecutively, i.e. one after the other, or concurrently, where they're all served at the same time. And the way the judge tends to differentiate between them is that if the offending or multiple offences are committed during one instance, then the judge will impose a concurrent sentence for that offending. And if there are multiple victims, so for example in the case of Eleanor Williams, she made false rape allegations against 3 victims, so they were separate to each other, the judge imposed consecutive sentences for each of the charges. So the general differentiating factor will be whether the offences fall out of the same fact pattern or whether they are separate to each other. The final thing that you might not know about criminal sentencing is that there are what's known as mandatory minimum sentences. And what that means is that for certain sentences, they will either be a mandatory minimum sentence for committing the offence the first time, or some offences have what's known as a 3 strikes rule, whereby if you commit a certain type of offence for the 3rd time, you will receive a mandatory minimum sentence. So an example of an offence that has a mandatory minimum for a first offence is the offence of murder. Anyone convicted of murder will receive a life sentence and then a minimum term unless they're going to receive a whole life order. And then an example of an offence with a mandatory minimum after 3 strikes is domestic household burglary. So if an individual is convicted of a 3rd domestic or dwelling burglary, they will receive a mandatory minimum of 3 years. Now that could be much higher than that, but the minimum that they will receive is 3 years. And they're also the same for other types of offences, such as drug offences and firearms offences. But in general, there are mandatory minimums for certain types of offending. So to summarise, number 1, it's not all about punishment. There are 5 principles of sentencing adult offenders in England and Wales, of which punishment is one element. Number 2, when it comes to sentencing, judges are looking to place an offence into a category based on 2 factors, culpability and harm. Number 3, life sentences do not automatically mean that an individual will spend life in prison. Number 4, sentences for multiple offences can either be concurrent to each other or consecutive, generally based on whether the facts fall out of the same fact pattern or whether they are separate to each other. And number 5 is that for certain types of offences, there is a mandatory minimum sentence. So in the example that we used, murder attracts a minimum of life imprisonment, and certain offences like 3 strikes domestic household burglary attract a minimum of 3 years. Thanks for watching. If you do have any comments, please post them down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like. And if you'd like to see more from me, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. Take care.